All right, so we'll go and begin by looking at our Snorkel API demo notebook. Let's open this up in full screen. That's this guy right here. Make this a bit bigger. So just to start out, for people that have not used Jupyter Notebooks before, this provides you an interactive environment for running and testing Python code. It runs in a browser, and it operates around this idea of a cell. So you can have documentation, and then you can actually execute each of these individual code bits by clicking this play button up here at the top. And this will execute the Python code, and it allows us a way to sort of walk through a tutorial, interactively running parts as we read information about them. So Snorkel is built around the idea of candidates and what's called context or context objects. And simply put, a candidate is formally defined as some set of contexts. What does that mean? Well, to go back to our spouse example that we've been discussing in the slides, a spouse consists of two contexts, which are just a pair of people's names. A segment of text in a sentence is called a span, and a span is a type of context. So a spouse is just a pair of those, pair of contexts. We have done most of this setup for you, but when you're running a Snorkel application, you need to define a type for use with all of our labeling function and model training. To define a spouse type, you can use this candidate subclass helper function, which essentially takes as arguments the name of the type, in this case spouse, and then the name for the arguments, which are person 1 and person 2. So as an exercise, just to test your initial understanding of what we just talked about, why don't you go ahead and define a candidate type for person, which you should see immediately. The difference here is that a spouse was a set of two contexts encoding a marriage relation between people. A person is just some segment of text mapping to a person's name. So how would you do that? Go ahead and provide your answer here, and we'll do it for you. We'll run this to make certain that we're good. So we're going to call this person, and unlike the spouse type above, we only have one argument. Let's just keep it consistent. And we have a little helper function here that will check the type for us and see if we got it correct. And we did. Notice here that the only real difference, we picked different names, is that this only has one context argument. To dive into a little more depth here, again, this is the spouse relation of a sentence embedded in its text. And for the purposes of all of our tutorials, we assume that we are classifying over sentence context objects. If you get into more advanced uses of Snorkel, you can define other contexts. And in fact, there is a formal context hierarchy. A span is just some segment of text. That would be like Michelle Obama. A sentence is this full sentence object here. And then a span lives in a sentence. And like that, a sentence lives in a document. And this is a formal, again, hierarchy that you are able to extend with your own custom objects should you need it for your application. The other big detail that we'll hit, this just sort of elaborates this notion of candidate member functions and variables. But if you wanted to query candidates from the database, we've prepared a database for you behind the scenes. So for all these tutorials today, you will have a database that we've already generated. We have a set of advanced tutorials that are also in the same folder that you can look at if you want to see how we built that database. But the theme of today's workshop is mostly to focus on designing and evaluating labeling functions. So for those purposes, we assume you've just already have a database created. To pull candidates from that database, you use a bit of what's called SQL alchemy language. This is just a syntax for interacting with your database. By and large, you won't have to do this in the tutorials, but it's good to be aware of how you do it. You have a session object that connects to your database. You can issue a query that operates over some type. And here what we're saying is I want to filter my candidates to split 0, where split here is the standard train, dev, test splits that we commonly use in machine learning. This split 0 maps to train, and it's just simply all the training candidates that we will use to learn a model. As another quick test, this object that is returned by the query is a list, and this exercise here asks you to fetch the 222nd item in this list. To do that, all we have to do is use, again, our handy helper function here and pass in the type. Oops, I forgot to make this a good example. Notice that I accidentally skipped here. Make certain that you always are executing your cells in order, otherwise you'll get goofy errors. So see here that we have some problem. I'm not quite certain what the deal is, but this should return a correct answer for your notebook. So finally, I won't go into too much detail here, but I encourage you to look this over. There is a bunch of methods by which you can interact with candidate objects. And this will make much more sense when we start playing around with labeling functions. But every candidate has a bit of information that you could conceive of taking advantage of when you write a labeling function. For example, if we analyze the first candidate in that candidate list that we generated above in this bit right here, we might want to access the names of person 1 and person 2. We might want to access certain attributes of those names, like the words themselves, the part of speech tags, or things like NER tags, which these are just named entity recognition information. And we'll go ahead and execute this, and you'll see this spits out all of the content that we've generated. So this is person candidate 0, person 1, person 2 is Adam and Katie. You'll see that the words associated with person 1 is, again, Adam. It's a noun. That's a part of speech tag. And then it is of NER type. That's the entity type that we introduced in our terminology section. It is of type person. And we'll want to generate some context here. This is our sentence. This is our document. And we'll want to look at some of these helper functions, so it will make use of a lot when writing labeling functions in our next notebook. They have things like get left tokens, get right tokens, get between tokens, get text between, get tagged text. And this will be more concrete as we look at actual examples when writing labeling functions in the next notebook. But these basically will take in a candidate and generate some information in the neighborhood around that span. So for this one, we were passing in this first candidate, which again is this Adam and Katie bit, and we're pulling the words to the immediate left and immediate right of those mentions for the candidate. And if we wanted to find the words in between, we just invoke this get between text function. And then you might want to leave this notebook open as you interact with the other tutorials. We've put together a cheat sheet. You can click this link here to read the full Snorkel documentation. And this just gives you a full list of all of the helper functions for candidates and internal member functions that you may find useful as you write labeling functions. And then here's just a list of attributes that are present in every sentence object that you can also take advantage of.